In the countryside, bees are dying, and honey today is becoming increasingly rare.
In Paris, apparently everything's fine. There are no problems. They make lots of honey, and it's of good quality.
But honey from French towns will not replace imported products, which have tripled in just 15 years. A booming market that encourages cheating and swindling.
All the lighter masses that appear here are layers of yeast. There's clearly a sanitary problem with Chinese honeys. Sometimes we find dreadful stuff.
Like soy flour, dried egg white. There are loads of things.
Honey is a well-known sweetener, but its healing powers are often ignored.
In the Quran, there's a verse that says something like, everything that passes through a bee's stomach is a medicine.
Could honey and other hive-related products be our future antibiotics?
The nurse had never seen anything like it because the honey had done her job for her.
Spreading honey on a piece of toast shouldn't be taken for granted. People talk of dwindling bee populations and the risks for pollination, but often neglect another aspect, the increasing scarcity of an astonishing product and of everything the bees make inside their hives. Honey is featured in every civilization and is one thing that man has never been able to make himself. At this apiary in the Courneuve Park in the Paris suburbs, we witnessed the first spring harvest of a hawthorn honey that Alan Sandmeyer has carefully allowed to ripen.
We can harvest the honey when the frames are sealed like this. It's like when jam is ready, we put a lid on the jar. When the honey's ready, particularly in terms of water content, the bees know and seal it up here. The honey has to have between 16 and 17% water content, whereas the nectar, when they collect it, has around 60% water content. And so it's essential that they remove the water. And it's only when they estimate that there's around 16 to 17% that they seal up the honeycomb with wax. At that point, we see that we can collect it. And we're sure it will have a water content of 15, 16 or 17%, and that it can be preserved for several years, no problem. So here the frame is perfectly sealed up. The honey is ready to be harvested.
Alan Sandmeyer is in charge of the apiary in the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris. He's passionate about bees, and especially the honey they produce.
It's fantastic when you see what they make. To produce 1 kilo of honey, the bees have to fly about 40 to 50,000 kilometers. So you can imagine the work involved in that, and the respect that we should have for the creatures.
40,000 kilometers, or almost a trip around the world to make 1 kilogram of honey. So when will we stop seeing honey as just another foodstuff we eat because it's sweet? Looking for high-quality honey often means small-scale production networks. A vast majority of French honeys today are sold by beekeepers themselves at local markets.
This is spring honey I harvested and bottled last night.
This one?
Yeah, that one.
Real honey enthusiasts know what they want, and appreciating honey means identifying specific origins and flavors, like with wine.
So here we have French thyme, which is rare.
In her shop in Paris, Sylvette Vidal offers tastes of every variety on display.
The initial taste of this one is quite unusual, and then it changes a bit.
It's delicious.
It's very unexpected. There's a taste of licorice in there, I find.
Yes.
And the taste is quite strong.
Yes, it's surprising.
And it lasts a long time, too. The oak honey comes from the Lozère department. That's where it's produced, and it is tasty.
Very tasty.
Exactly. It would be hard to deny it.
Every season brings a new honey, if nature is allowed to take its course.
Every September when I open the shop, the customers arrive and they all ask me, "What have you found for us this year?" So I have to surprise them every year. This year, there was one beekeeper who put his hives in a place where there were rhododendrons. And rhododendron honey is quite rare. But the flowers came late. And so the bees collected from other flowers lower down and filled the hives. And then they went back to the rhododendrons later. So this meant that he didn't get a rhododendron honey, but something else. A mountain honey, a mountain forest honey, which was excellent. And so we can benefit from this mistake. And next year, perhaps we'll find something else like that.
Sylvette Vidal knows each of the beekeepers she works with, which is far from being the case with the high street retailers. In France, half of what is consumed is imported. And when the prices are low, around €2 for a 250-gram jar, the quality is often an issue. Paul Schweitzer is a biologist. Every year, some 2,500 honeys are examined under his microscope. What he sees in the low-cost honeys is far from reassuring.
All the lighter masses that appear here are layers of yeast. And when we have yeasts like that, it's not just an isolated yeast. It forms whole layers because the yeasts have multiplied, and when they multiply, they stay stuck together like that. Paradoxically, the honey we've just tasted doesn't present any signs of fermentation. Why? Because the honey began to ferment, and indeed underwent a lot of fermentation, but it was then pasteurized, which means that the yeasts died, but the ones that had already multiplied are still there, and it's their dead bodies we're seeing here.
The dead yeast is not dangerous for human consumption, but prove that these honeys have been transported in badly cleaned containers. A flagrant lack of hygiene that for Paul Schweitzer indicates the same origin.
Well, it's not easy singling out one country, but what's obvious is that all, or nearly all, the Chinese honeys coming onto the market are like this. More or less, anyway. Some will have less yeast, but they all have significant quantities of yeast. And so there's quite clearly a sanitary problem with the Chinese honeys.
It's not the first time that Chinese honey has been denounced. For 2 years, between 2002 and 2004, it was banned from European markets because it contained traces of chloramphenicol, an antibiotic that can have adverse effects on human health.
At present, the Chinese honeys have come back onto the market and are authorized by the European Union again. They're not as catastrophic as they might have appeared a few years ago, but in terms of the yeasts, it's pretty much the same thing, to the extent that substantial amounts of yeast in a honey almost certainly indicate a specific geographic origin, meaning that we know it came from China.
More than half of the cheaper honey products sold in supermarkets are mixed with Chinese honey. The problem is that distributors are not obliged to mention the source, apart from a country of origin stipulation concerning made or not made in the EU. To taste a really exceptional honey, we head for Morocco. In the Sousse Valley, 100 kilometers or so northeast of Agadir, one of the country's finest honeys is harvested. The conditions are ideal: a year-round sunny climate and a well-preserved and bountiful environment. It's hardly surprising the locals have called it the Valley of Paradise.
You can see the poppies. The bees are gathering nectar. From the dandelions, too. And the cactus plants that are flowering at the moment. The bees collect pollen from all of them. We have everything we need here. We have all these flowers in the mountains here, and that's why we have very pure honey. We don't give powdered sugar to our bees, unlike some people elsewhere. Thanks be to God, we have all we need now the drought is over.
In a good season, the honey provides a living for everyone here and has done for generations. A heritage only rarely threatened.
There were some very hard times when we had to move to the north because of the drought. And there was one year when we were invaded by desert locusts. The treatment to get rid of them decimated our bees.
Some of the bees here are still kept in traditional wicker hives. Modernity has appeared in the form of newer hives, but not in farming methods. Local agriculture is devoid of any pesticides.
When you see a frame like this, regular, with no holes or imperfections, it means the hive is a healthy hive.
In these regions, honey is a feature of every festive meal and ceremonial occasion, the first thing offered to any guests. In this family, 5 different varieties are produced.
That's euphorbia honey, thyme honey, and this one's carob tree honey. This is argan oil honey. We produce the orange tree honey first, then comes the thyme honey, that's the most important harvest in the year. After the thyme, we have the euphorbia honey. And then it's the carob tree season. This allows the bees to get their strength back. We keep them here as long as possible, and at the end of the year, we let them collect the nectar from the almond trees.
Among the different varieties, the thyme honey merits special attention.
Thyme honey from the region of Idaoutanan. It's the best in the country. They say here it is the honey of all honeys. It is really top quality. That's why it's in such demand throughout Morocco.
And this thyme honey, produced here for centuries, could become a rare commodity. Our encounter with this elderly man raised a number of questions.
I used to come here during the honey harvest. The first collection was always mine. I'd eat it all day long, and I loved it. At the time I was 15 years old. I used to come here with my father.
This communal apiary, the biggest in the world, is today abandoned. But 25 years ago, it was fully operational and could contain up to 4,000 hives.
There was a lot of thyme and medicinal plants. The bees had plenty of food. Nature was generous. I even saw my grandmother washing clothes with honey. At the time, there was no soap or detergent. But now look. When I see the state this apiary is in, it breaks my heart. God willed it.
With successive droughts, massive migration to the towns and less skilled labour, the thyme honey once produced here so abundantly has stopped flowing. The prospect of shortages in Morocco today is a sad reality. The price has never been higher, and demand keeps pushing it up. At the local market, beekeepers trade at around 30 euros a kilo, a level that prohibits exports, as the price of a good honey in France reaches barely 18 euros a kilo.
I've come far. I've travelled 10 kilometres today just to get this honey. People buy it even if it's expensive. When they can't afford it, they find a way of buying just a little quantity. But they do buy.
It's become a luxury product, to the point where even in a producing country, cheap substitutes appear, looking like the real thing, but costing just 20 cents a pot. No one here is fooled. They know that their thyme honey, known as the nectar of the gods, has an almost sacred reputation and is renowned for all manner of magical properties.
In the Quran, there's a verse that says something like, "Everything that passes through a bee's stomach is a medicine."
It's a vital product here too for its medicinal qualities. In these isolated regions where roads are few and far between, the thyme honey is a godsend. And it can treat and cure pretty much everything.
If one of our children is sick or has stomach ache, we give them a spoonful of honey and it goes away. When someone has an irritation in the eye, we apply a bit of honey and it goes away. If someone burns themselves with tea or hot water, we apply a bit of honey and it acts like medicine. Sometimes we mix the honey with medicinal plants too, like white wormwood, oregano, or lavender. It's good for coughs and for your lungs.
Ancestral wisdom, passed down from one generation to the next, and today studied by Western medicine. In France too, honey is used for healing. The healing or cicatrization properties of honey work on burns, sores and wounds, including post-surgery wounds, like in this digestive surgery department at a hospital in Limoges.
Does it itch a bit when we apply it? How is it?
It feels a bit hot.
Okay.
It lasts 30 or 40 minutes.
But it's not unbearable?
Oh, no, it's very mild.
Perfect.
It's true, it's quite impressive at first. It's weird.
Were you surprised to learn how the nurses were going to work on your wound?
Oh, at first, yes, of course. I didn't think you could help close the wound with honey. But it's good, it doesn't hurt, and it seems to be acting very quickly.
We've observed over a number of years now that the healing process is really very interesting. That's why we use it.
When you say interesting,
it means we gain about 8 days.
An old wives' remedy that the hospital staff here have been using for 25 years. The initiative came through the intuition of a pioneering doctor, Professor Descott, who has since passed on.
It began with Professor Descott in the 80s, when we used very few products, very few medical procedures. Our knowledge of cicatrization was limited, I suppose, to doing what was normally done, but we didn't necessarily understand what was going on, not compared to what we know today. So he set us on this road with honey, and he said, "Go ahead, we'll see what we can learn." And a group of us really got interested and passionate about this work because of the honey and because the healing worked. That's how it started.
It certainly had a miraculous effect on mountaineer Antoine Bonfils. If he can walk today, it's because he instinctively understood what the product could do for him. After climbing Mount Everest in 2008, he had to have 5 toes amputated. On Professor Descott's advice, he used honey to heal the wounds.
My mother had read an article in a health magazine about Professor Descott and his work at the Limoges Hospital. We got in touch with him. At that point, he sent me a clinical protocol and he said, "You know, honey can help you with cicatrization and it can even help to heal the wounds 3 times quicker."
and was that the case?
That was the case.
The doctors who had amputated had said it would take a year for the wound to heal, with all the risks of infection that entailed.
After a month and a half, the wound had practically healed over.
The scarring process was spectacular and also eliminated the need for painkillers, such as morphine.
From one day to the next, we stopped the morphine. The nurse had never seen anything like it in her life. 30 or 35 years in medicine, and she'd never seen that before. She didn't know what to do, because the honey had done her job for her. It was miraculous. We'd ordered a 1 kilo tub of thyme honey. It's funny, because I was expecting to see this tub arriving like a sterile tub with some kind of sophisticated lid to open or something. But not at all. It was just a tub of ordinary cooking honey made by a beekeeper. Organic honey. And in 3 months we used maybe 500 grams. And the 500 grams that were left we ended up using on our toast or in our tea.
Should we still have doubts about honey's healing properties? About its effects on cell proliferation or its antibacterial qualities? When will we finally know all its secrets? In any case, it could soon be sold in chemist shops. At the Limoges hospital, they're working on a new prototype, a medicinal sterile honey supplied in tubes.
This is a tube of honey prepared by the laboratory. It's a rather special formula which uses several different single flower honeys, which were selected for their inhibitory properties against most of the germs to be found in a hospital.
I think that having honey in tubes will mean that the medical profession will use it much more. And that's a step forward. It's reassuring for the development of our work.
The name of the medical use of honeybee products is apitherapy. This covers the use of honey itself, but also royal jelly, pollen, and propolis. Françoise Sauvager is a retired pharmacologist.
Have you seen the queen?
She became involved with propolis some 30 years ago when she wrote a thesis on its antiviral qualities, notably with herpes. It's often her first choice in the treatment of a number of infections. In her garden in the suburbs of Rennes, she has set up around 20 hives to supply her with the special ingredient.
Propolis is this resinous substance that you can see on the material that's placed on the frames in springtime. The bees don't like holes, so they fill them in using the propolis. It's also a medicine for them, because they use it for all manner of things. They use it to embalm the dead bodies of large intruders in the hives. For example, larger creatures like field mice, slugs, mice, and lizards that might come into the hive. They're killed by the bee's venom, and to avoid the bodies rotting through germs in the intestines, they cover them completely with propolis, and they become disinfected. It's like the Egyptians, who used propolis to mummify bodies. The bees use the propolis to mummify any intruders that come into the hives.
And so a product from bygone days is once again being widely used, this time to alleviate the problem of resistance to certain antibiotics.
Since the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, but particularly the end of the 19th century, when chemical synthesis began, we've tended to overlook these more natural products. But now, with the problem of highly resistant germs, due to the overuse of antibiotics, we're seeing mutant organisms which resist practically every antibiotic that's available. For example, the Staphylococcus aureus is said to be multi-drug resistant. There are strains that are resistant to many antibiotics, whole families of antibiotics, and even to vancomycin, which was the main anti-Staphylococcus drug 15 or 20 years ago. And so we now find ourselves confronted with germs that resist everything. And in this case, propolis in particular is an effective response.
There are also applications in cancerology. Numerous clinical studies into propolis and chemotherapy are being carried out today. Near Agen in southwestern France, Patrice Percy-Ducer sells propolis and works with various oncologists to further the cause of a product he believes has been overlooked too long. But there's another product of the hive that he has been exploring for some 15 years. A former beekeeper and agricultural engineer, he is a pollen specialist. His work has focused on determining the characteristics of a range of different pollens. He's just returned from Andalusia, where he went to find something not to be found in France: the pollen of a flowering plant called cistus.
These are images that aren't easy to get, as the bees are extremely mobile on the flowers.
In these images that Patrice filmed himself, we can see the clusters of pollen the bees gather from the flowers with their hind legs and take back to their hives. They contain a truly exceptional nutritional value.
In pollen, you have what we can find in fruit and vegetables, but in colossal concentrations. For example, in a soup spoon of cistus pollen, just 15 grams, you have 40% of the recommended daily intake of vitamin E. Vitamin E is a vital vitamin, and French people on average are 30% short of the recommended daily intake, so a soup spoonful could make up for that deficiency. It also provides polyphenols. We talk about polyphenols in red wine, for example, but if you take pollen from a chestnut tree, one soup spoonful contains as much polyphenol as 4 or 5 liters of red wine or green tea, so that's the nutritional value of pollen.
He believes the pollen should be consumed fresh in order to preserve all the active qualities. He's patented a nitrogen freezing process which enables him to produce and distribute more than 50 tons of pollen a year to retail outlets. But he is also targeting pharmaceutical laboratories, as he's convinced that pollen should be more widely used in medicine.
I'll cut off a small branch.
He works regularly with doctors and scientists to identify the therapeutic properties of individual pollens.
This is a male catkin, or the male flower cluster from a willow, which gives pollen. And we have another plant with a female flower cluster, which gives the willow seeds. So the bees have to transport the pollen from the male flower to the female flower to stimulate fertilization, so the tree can provide fruits. Without bees, the pussy willow trees couldn't reproduce.
It is little known that the willow pollen, once gathered and transformed by the bees, is of great interest to medicine for its potential in treating AMD, macular degeneration, a vision ailment linked to age that affects some 30 million people around the world.
The willow pollen is one of the richest in carotenoids. It contains as much carotenoid as carrots, for example, but they're not the same carotenoids. Carrots contain mostly beta-carotene, whereas willow pollen contains lutein and zeaxanthin, which are very valuable in protecting the retina from age-related macular degeneration.
This is just one example among many pollens that have other properties that scientific research is barely beginning to explore. For Patrice Persidisseur, his biggest problem is obtaining supplies. He finds just 15% of what he needs in France, and from one year to the next, the pollen is becoming increasingly harder to find.
This is a mix of prune trees, prune tree flowers, and below that there are some willows. The bees have moved from the willows to the plum trees. We gather this every 4 days, and so in the 2 trays we've collected 500 grams.
His mission this year, to keep his company and its 16 employees going, is to find 20 tons. He's currently in negotiations with Romania, a country where he's sure he can find good organic pollen.
Romania is the European country where we've lost the fewest bees and where the bees are in good health. There are whole regions like Transylvania and the Carpathian Mountains where no pesticides are used, or almost no pesticides, because the agriculture is mainly small-scale food crop farming. They're very poor and they can't afford to buy pesticides, so they get by without them, just as we did in France 200 years ago.
This morning, he's on the phone with a colleague in Romania.
Good morning, Frederic.
Morning, how are you?
Well, not bad. So.
He's rather concerned as he can't take anything for granted. Last year, he had a major problem with a Romanian supplier.
The weather's really nice, so things are looking good.
How are the willows coming along?
Well, it depends on the region. They're starting to flower now, but things will really take off in a week or so, not before. But I'm really not worried about the quantities we should be getting. We'll be able to get what we need, no problem.
That's great.
So this partnership deal is a great success. Really, a great success.
You've reassured me. I was pretty worried about it.
No, really. The news is good concerning the two beekeepers we met before. They've both given us some new contacts so we can sleep better at night.
Well, I certainly will sleep better. Listen, keep up the good work. I'll see you on Friday.
Thanks. See you Friday then.
It's a very emotional moment. Because it's a huge deal for the company. It represents 1/3 of what we buy. And if we mess it up, we're done for. 1/3 of our supplies. Do you see what I mean? With a company like this, we may make 5, 6 or 7% profit at the end of the year. And if we have no pollen to sell, we still have all the overheads to pay, and it's all very fragile. You understand? That's the way it is. It's a battle every day. It's not easy.
Despite everything, Patrice Persiducer will manage to buy 18 tons this year. Is French pollen going to become a rare commodity? This is already the case with royal jelly, a concentration of vitamins and amino acids that is said to provide a beneficial boost. Within the hive, the queen alone eats the royal jelly, and this exclusive diet enables her to live 40 times longer than the worker bees. The proof, apparently, is in the eating. Barely a handful of beekeepers have chosen to produce royal jelly, like Remy Pellissier, who we meet in the share department. National production in France covers just 2% of total consumption.
Well, there you see, I've been lucky. I was looking for the queen and I found her on the first frame. So I'll separate her, and I'll put her over here.
Producing royal jelly entails playing hide and seek with the bees, making them believe the queen has disappeared from the hive so that they feed new larvae for 3 days, making a replacement queen.
3 days is the optimal time. If we wait a day longer, we'll get a huge larva that'll have eaten all the royal jelly, so there won't be any left. It's after exactly 3 days that the cycle works best for us.
Gathering the larvae, placing them in the honeycombs and replacing them in the hive, extracting a small quantity of jelly each time. Each step is complicated and has to be meticulously completed, making the jelly an expensive product in terms of the work involved. The main reason why it's massively imported from China.
Royal jelly is basically a question of time. And we know that for everything that's manufactured in China, or elsewhere now for that matter, not just in China, the labor costs completely change the cost of the product, which is probably around 30 times lower than ours.
And so we go to meet the biggest French importer of royal jelly. As it happens, he's also the biggest dealer in honey and honey derivatives.
Benoît Marie, nice to see you.
The family company that Benoît Marie runs is situated in the suburbs of Nantes. They have 23 shops in France, plus a mail order business, and have recently developed a new line in apiculture products for spas and beauty salons. He knows how to make royal jelly and still maintains a few hives to show visitors. But he's decided to stop producing it and concentrate purely on honey production.
The types of bees that are the best for royal jelly are not automatically the best for producing honey. It's difficult to combine efficient honey production with royal jelly production.
All the royal jelly his company sells today comes from China. It's a cost issue, although as a businessman, he's reticent about discussing details.
How much royal jelly does the Mary family sell every year?
Oh, a few tons, let's say.
A few tons? That means how many?
That's confidential.
In fact, he imports more than 200 tons every year. At 15 euros for a 10-gram jar in a shop, it would appear the royal jelly niche market is flourishing. But Benoit Marie doesn't like people saying his jelly comes from China.
Does it bother you to talk about Mongolia? Is that a problem? I'd prefer it if it's possible. If you like, it's a problem for us because people aren't bothered about talking about Tibet, and Tibet's in China. And talking about Mongolia doesn't bother them at all, and that's the truth of it. And that's where it's produced. But any mention of China is very negative. And so we have to explain and explain again. It's awful.
Mongolia, then, with its high plains, its flowers, its clean air,
and where the environment is extremely healthy.
Admittedly, Benoit Marie has agreed to be open with us. He takes us to his warehouses to explain the constraints of the cold chain. His royal jelly is transported by ship, frozen, and then stored in his fridges.
It's defrosted when it arrives in the port. After that, it's sent to a laboratory to be analyzed, to check the quality in terms of amino acids, minerals, and what have you, to guarantee there are no contaminants, and to be given an EcoCert certificate. After that, it arrives here, chilled, ready for consumption, and we stock it here at a temperature of 5 degrees.
In view of the risks of defects and deception often associated with China, we decided to have the royal jelly analysed too. And so we go back to see Paul Schwetzer.
With regard to the antibiotic tests that we've done, the same as with the honey, there was no trace evidence found, so it meets the standards, but we have to see if it's been tampered with. One of the problems, one of the easiest ways to cheat with the royal jelly, is to add honey to it. Because the market price of the two products is very different, even by adding just 10 or 20% of honey to the royal jelly can be extremely lucrative in view of the quantities. And so we have various techniques to let us see that. We can analyze the sugar levels to see if there are specific honey sugars present and if the sugar profiles conform to what royal jelly should be like. And here we haven't observed any anomalies, so it conforms to what's been described. There are no signs of bad quality. There are Chinese royal jellies that can be very good. Apparently that's the case with this one, it has to be said. There are others which are catastrophic, where we know they've been tampered with. That does happen.
It's a phenomenon that Rémi Pelissier firmly condemns. Along with his colleagues, he's created a French royal jelly label with very strict standards. The bees have to be fed with pollen and nectar and nothing else. He's highly critical of the imported jellies.
They don't put anything in the jelly, or at least, I hope not. Not as far as I know. But it's above all in the way the hives are kept. It's possible, and I would repeat, it's possible, it's not systematic, but in certain situations, when Mother Nature does not provide the bees with all the elements they need to secrete the royal jelly, then they might add certain products that we don't allow, to replace the nectar and the pollen.
Like what?
Like with the pollen, they can replace it with brewer's yeast, or you can replace it with flour. And what they use the most over there is soybean flour, which is potentially transgenic. Products like that, things like dried egg white, loads of things. Whatever you can imagine, the possibilities are endless.
Will these ersatz royal jelly products be allowed to invade our markets for much longer? Who will determine that honey and other beehive products are noble foodstuffs that merit greater consideration? Honey imports too continue to soar. France alone has lost 15,000 beekeepers in the past 15 years, and for those who remain, their harvests are often uncertain. Loïc Leray is a beekeeper in the countryside around Nantes. The pesticides sprayed onto the surrounding fields have turned him into a bee doctor more than a honey producer. His harvests in the past 6 years have been unpredictable, and this year, with prolonged droughts, he will suffer further losses.
So already we have those frames which have been abandoned. This one suffered more than the others.
At this time of year, normally it should be filled with honey.
Here we should have 2 supers of honey. In this hive, in any case, we can say that we haven't got the quantity I could have hoped for. There's something in the environment around the apiary that means the hives have been affected. The spring honey harvest has been lost. There are 90 hives in this apiary, so that's about a ton. Between 900 kilos and a metric ton in the whole apiary. Oh, it's a bit depressing.
Such observations have led Loic Leray to rethink his beekeeping strategy and to mix business with politics. He decided to set up his hives in the regional council gardens in the very centre of Nantes, the seat of local power. And to his surprise, the urban bees have been very productive.
It's chock full of bees. That's a sign of good health. That's magnificent. That's a real bonus for us. It's great.
It's a pleasure that's renewed from one year to the next. Seeing the hives in springtime like this, it's a sign of abundance, or even overabundance, when it's like it is today. And seeing this, it makes it all the harder to take when you see hives dying. It's heartbreaking.
This is getting interesting here. You'll be needing a ladder soon to get to the top of the hive.
Hives on rooftops. Are cities becoming a new El Dorado for bees? The only refuge possible for the pollinating insects? Or are we being a teensy bit manipulated?
In Nantes, there are no pesticides used on the parks or gardens. So it allows the bees to work with no difficulties.
Some are fuller than others.
They usually start to fill up from the middle. And here we have one side frame that's already pretty full.
Here I get the same feeling as I would have with a healthy colony, not worrying about what I might find when I get to the hive. Like seeing dead bees lying around, or a colony that's been weakened, like the one we've just seen. It's reassuring, but in some ways, and this has to be repeated, a beekeeper's place is in the country. These bees here are essentially for raising people's awareness.
The bees' rural exodus is well underway. The trend of setting up hives in towns and cities is expanding. The bees are seen as environmental watchdogs. The idea is to position hives in visible places, particularly on rooftops, in order to publicize the fact that they're dying in the countryside. It's perhaps a purely political maneuver, but it's becoming increasingly popular. The trend has enabled Nicolas Géant to invent a new profession. He delivers and maintains hives for firms and companies.
All the swarms for this year have been reserved. I've got a few inhabited hives for June if you're interested. No, there's none left. They're all reserved. It's funny because I've been a beekeeper for more than 25 years. So I know my bees. 25 years ago, 20 years ago, 15, even 10 years ago. Nobody was interested in talking about bees. They couldn't care less about bees. But then all that changed 5 years ago. Not even, 3 or 4 years ago. Everyone became ecological. Fantastic. I spend half my time at dinner parties being bombarded with questions about bees. It's quite surprising. So bees became fashionable about 3 or 4 years ago, whereas before nobody wanted to know. You see all that? Those are acacias. And again there, all along, they're acacias. Some of them are flowering now. The white clusters we can see are acacia flowers. They've only been open a couple of days. It's just starting. And also over there on the right, the girls are going to love it. Just look at it. If you look closely, it's quite surprising. Paris is very green, like most big cities, even though we're much less green than Berlin or London.
Today he has 4 hives to deliver to a rooftop in the La Défense business quarter. It's a novelty for the company and its employees, and perhaps a symbol too.
They'll be fine here. They won't get the sun in the morning, but they'll get it afterwards all day long. They'll do very nicely here.
The next stop is in Montreuil, in the eastern suburbs.
Hello.
Monsieur Géant, hello.
Your 2 hives?
Fine, let's take a look.
Urban apiculture can be a tough sport.
That's the first one. Is that a good spot for you? Shall I push it back or bring it forward?
That's more for you to tell me, but we're in the part that will be reserved for them.
If you'd like to step back, I'll open it up so we can let them out. They'll come out. They'll fly around the hive 3 times to kickstart the GPS, as it were, and see where they are in relation to the sun, and then they can go to work, looking for nectar and pollen.
How many bees are there?
About 40 or 50,000. There's a queen, and for the moment about 1,500 to 2,000 males. They're what we call drones.
And they don't work?
Well, yes, they do work.
Oh, they do?
Their job is to fertilize the queen. Not a bad job.
Nice work if you can get it.
And there shouldn't be too much wind, is that right?
No, the bees don't like the wind. But we're nice and sheltered here. I don't think there's a problem.
The hives also help to provide the company with an environmental quality label.
One of the criteria is the installation of hives. I thought that was a nice idea and completely natural. It seemed like an integral part of the whole concept. And obviously people talk about it more than if we got rid of half our printers. Nobody's bothered about that. But with the hives, everyone's a bit surprised.
Hello, welcome to the Tour d'Argent.
Hello.
Nicolas' last visit for the day is to a famous Parisian restaurant. He's installed 6 hives here, which have been producing homemade honey for 4 years now. It's the only honey on the menu. And this year too, he has no doubts about the coming harvest.
It's nice and lively. Good and active. What you can see in the middle there, shining, is the nectar that the bees are in the process of transforming into honey.
Unlike the honey in the country, Nicolas never has an unpleasant surprise with these hives. The quantities are regular and predictable.
Last year my best hive was over there in La Défense, where we were this morning, and it produced not quite 100 kilos, between 80 and 90 kilos. But it was the best hive at that place at that particular time. This year it might be here, or maybe in Montreuil, where we were this morning, just over there, or it might be somewhere else. We'll see.
Is the honey produced in towns and cities as good as it's made out to be? What about traffic emissions and urban pollution? To get a definitive viewpoint, we make a final visit to our faithful expert, Paul Schwetzer.
We looked for the presence of several types of heavy metals: arsenic, cadmium, lead and mercury, the basic heavy metals. And there's nothing abnormal here. We then measured the PAHs, what we call polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which come essentially from automobile pollution with compounds we can find in the atmosphere. We looked for about 15 such molecules, and out of those 15 we found traces of fluoranthene and chrysene. But it has to be said that with these compounds we're going to find them more or less in every honey. It's not going to make the honey dangerous, because I would say that at the doses in question you'd need to consume quite astronomical amounts of honey to suffer any consequences.
If bees can put up with urban pollution better than the pesticides on our fields, does this mean we will only be consuming city-produced honey from now on? Just north of Paris, the town of Aubervilliers has 6 hives. Last year they produced 350 kilos of honey. At an event organized at a municipal swimming pool, the locals come to appreciate the cream of the crop.
It's like being in the middle of the countryside.
It's also an opportunity for a beekeeper from the Hérault department, Henri Clément, to raise awareness and to lobby some of the local politicians.
You're the mayor of Aubervilliers. Are you an MP as well?
No.
To spread the word about saving our bees and the risks of seeing honey in short supply, any opportunity should be exploited.
The vitality of our bee colonies have been so weakened with such massive mortality rates that world production can't keep up. For example, Argentina used to produce 110,000 tons of honey. Today, they make 60 to 70,000 tons. France, between 70 and 95, was the European leader in terms of production. At the time, we imported 6,000 or 7,000 tons. Today, we're importing 20 to 22,000 tons. In just 10 to 15 years, we're importing 3 times as much. It's a dramatic situation. So yes, in fact, I do believe honey will become a rare commodity.
Confronted by these potential shortages, do we not run the risk of seeing more and more ersatz honeys on our shelves? Honeys of inferior quality, fermented, doctored, unfit for human consumption, and above all, devoid of the healthy virtues and properties of real, authentic honey.